Hi, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our meeting today. It's a privilege for me today to introduce a friend of mine and a great researcher, Professor Eric McCollum. Eric is employed, I think it's always difficult to know, but he's employed through Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. That's where I met him as well, and he's also been doing a lot of work over the last few years. Don't know how many years, but the last few years, looking at a lot of interventions and lung health in children from low and middle income countries, especially in Bangladesh, and then also in Lesotho and Malawi. He's also had the privilege of going to the ATS conference recently, and he's going to be giving us an update on what he learned there so that we can all share that knowledge. So, Eric, go ahead. Thanks very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Charles. Thanks for having me. I don't think Marika and Di are on the line, but appreciate their invitation. And I try to join this meeting when I can. I've had conflicts of late, but it's not because I don't want to join. And yes, it's been wonderful to work with Charles. I've been working with Charles for almost like a decade, believe it or not. And we've survived each other and learned a lot. And I've definitely learned a ton from Charles. So it's great to be here. And so I'm going to go through a selected pediatric lung function abstracts. I was asked by Marika and Di, since I was able to go to the American Thoracic Society meeting, to pull out some of the lung function abstracts that would be potentially relevant for us in a LMIC context, specifically an African context. And I think that this can be informal. It's not intended for me just to be talking. So hopefully, I'll kind of pause after each abstract. I'm not necessarily able to see anything right now, Charles. So if there is anybody, or if you want to come in, I think just do it. Just come in and I'll pause and we can talk. I've selected 7 abstracts. This is not a comprehensive review of the overall ATS conference. It's an enormous conference. I do recommend it, if, in the future, it's a conference that you can attend. There's a lot of stuff that's covered that, can be relevant to what we do here. These abstracts, so I did a lit search within the conference, because I obviously couldn't be in all the sessions, to kind of pull out the ones that I thought would be most relevant for us. All are focused on infants or children. One does have adults in it as well, but that'll hopefully be apparent as to why. I tried to kind of select out a range of lung function tests and ages within the pediatric spectrum. You'll see that there's a lot of interest in oscillometry, based on what was available and accepted at the conference. And as I said, all of these are either directly or indirectly applicable to our context. So the first abstract that I pulled out was on premature infants. And this work was by Jordan and colleagues. And the title is extreme. And the other thing, just to mention, obviously this is not my work. So I'm just going to be sharing, what the abstract is and just the highlighted points. And yeah, anyway, just to make that point again. So Jordan and colleagues, the title of their abstract is Extremely Premature Infants Who Experienced Inflammatory Events Have Decreased Expiratory Flow Ratios at Hospital Discharge than peers without inflammatory events. So the title gives the take home here. But I thought it was, useful. This is kind of how I structured it, going through the rationale, methods, results, and then the conclusion. So as we know, BPD is common. It's, the 40 to 50% of extreme preemies. It leads to a diminished peak lung function in adulthood. So it's very important from a lung function perspective. And I think, I wasn't acutely aware of this. And so I think this was interesting, and I think makes sense to me, is that inflammatory conditions may worsen lung function among preemies, and this could amplify susceptibility to actually developing bronchopulmonary dysplasia. And Evidence to date suggests that these inflammatory episodes can exacerbate already impaired lung function. And that was, so the aim of this was to further investigate this using a single center prospective study, 44 infants. These are less than 28 weekers born over the 2019 to 2022 period. These are unsedated lung function tests. So although they didn't fully specify it, based on what they presented, I'm fairly certain it's TBFVL and respiratory oscillometry. But these tests were done prior to NICU discharge. And, in our setting, my work with Charles, in Bangladesh, we are not sedating infants for these lung function tests. And so this is something that, for that reason, BPD as well thought this would be a useful one to share. They defined inflammatory events as bacteremia, necrotizing enterocolitis, culture negative sepsis requiring inotropic support. So remember, these are NICU, understandably NICU infants given their extreme prematurity. And then they modeled average lung function parameters using linear regression and adjusted for the delivery mode, preeclampsia, chorioamnionitis, antenatal corticosteroids, maternal diabetes, growth restriction, and then used an alpha of 0.05 as what would be the standard. And so in terms of results, the mean gestational age of the 44 infants is 25.5 weeks. They're small, 778 grams. And these lung function measurements were obtained at an average of 41.3 weeks post-menstrual age. And so, they presented 3 parameters here, which is the time to peak tidal expiratory flow to the expiratory time, this ratio, which we know is important for airway obstruction. The compliance of the respiratory system, resistance of the respiratory system, and they're showing here mean values. And so as the title conveys, they did see a statistically significant difference between the extreme preemies that had inflammatory events compared to those who did not, suggesting that given the lower ratio, suggesting that there is more peripheral airway obstruction in these premature infants. And that's what that kind of take-home point says right there. And essentially so their data supports the conclusion that among these extreme preemies, systemic inflammation episodes can worsen lung function. Maybe I'll stop there and just if there's any comments, see if I can from anyone.
Hi, Eric, it's Di. Sorry, I was a little bit late. Are these inflammation episodes related to respiratory infections mostly?
So they defined their inflammatory events as really
or any of them. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I missed it. I was a bit late. Thanks.
No problem. Yeah, bacteremia in neck, and then culture negative sepsis requiring inotropic support. Yeah. All right. Well, if there's nothing else, I'll just continue on. So this next one I selected out because it's comparing oscillometry to multiple breath washout. Abstract also is from the same group. They kind of build on each other. And so the title of this abstract is that measures of ventilation inhomogeneity in children with cystic fibrosis, intra-breath oscillometry versus multiple breath washout. And I think, as we know, there's I don't know if it's an emerging area, but I would describe it as an emerging area with intra-breath oscillometry. It's something that we've talked a lot about on our group, our Bangladesh group, with Charles and Zoli and his team. That's something that we're kind of working on, and certainly he has a lot of interest in. And yeah, so this is kind of building on that. So although this is a group of children with cystic fibrosis, we do have other, conditions that might be more common, representing peripheral airway disease or airway disease, that this could still potentially be relevant for us. I thought it'd be worth sharing. So multiple breath washout, in terms of the rationale, is the gold standard for detecting early changes in peripheral airways, suggesting ventilation inhomogeneity in CF. But I think as we know, the feasibility is low. It's certainly a challenging test to conduct in young children, infants, and it's fairly resource intensive. I know it's something that we were successful in doing it, but it was certainly not easy. Intra-breath oscillometry, which they've abbreviated as IBOSC. As we know, I'll kind of state this anyway, just so everybody's on the same page, measures the respiratory system resistance, reactance during tidal breathing, and we generally think of it as highly feasible since it's measured during tidal breathing. Measures of reactance during intra-breath oscillometry include the small peripheral airways, and overall are, according to the authors, governed by the same multiple breath washout physiologic principles. And so their aim was to explore specifically whether reactance measures correlate with multiple breath washout, ventilation, and inhomogeneity. And so this was a group of 91 children with cystic fibrosis. And they used the Tremaflow device to do the intra-breath measurements at 10 Hertz frequency, and then they followed a standard multiple breath washout protocol with nitrogen. And then they classified the MBW results as normal or abnormal using a cut point on the LCI 2.5% of greater than 7 turnovers. And measures of the measures of reactance were compared between the MBW groups using the Mann-Whitney U test. So in terms of their results, they ended up having 79 paired measurements. 61% of their participants were male, median age of 7.2 years, with that interquartile range. Height is given there. And they found that an abnormal multiple breath washout was achieved in 43% of those paired measurements. And they didn't, I'm not showing this here because it was kind of too much information, but there are no differences between the normal or abnormal MBW groups in the variables that would be relevant here. And so you can see from the table, on the left-hand side is the reactance parameter. So XE big E is end expiratory, XE big I is end inspiratory, XE big E to E big I is the reactance at the end inspiratory to end expiratory to end inspiratory. And then the delta X to the change in reactance to tidal volume is characterized as volume dependence. And that'll come up in the next abstract as well. So you can see that they have the normal LCI and abnormal LCI groups there. So 45 and 34 participants there with the p-values. And basically what you can see across the board is all of the reactance measurements are more negative, suggesting, in my interpretation, generally stiffer lungs in these groups that have the abnormal MBW. And so the author's conclusions were that the intra-breath reactance variables may indeed reflect ventilation inhomogeneity, given these kind of consistent relationships. And this is intriguing, given the fact that, intra-breath oscillometry and oscillometry overall is, potentially a more feasible lung function measurement to implement more routinely than MBW. And I don't necessarily extrapolate that outside of CF, but I think that holds that potential, which I thought was interesting. Any thoughts or comments on this one?
I put my comment. Yeah, somebody else.
Hi, Eric. This is Peter Moscovas. Really, really cool. Does anyone else on the call have any experience doing this? Like in terms of the logistics of calculating these?
Doing intra-breath?
Yeah.
Charles, come in.
Hi, yeah. I mean, we've got quite a bit of experience doing intra-breath, and the only thing is it's just a bit of a longer epoch that you record on the children. So it's very much the same as the old measurement that we do on oscillometry. I think that the challenges with it is at the moment that it's still in the production phase, let's put it like that, and it's quite difficult to get the data extracted. There's no easy programs for it yet, but I hope that'll be coming soon. So, but it's quite an easy test to do, and quite a helpful test to do.
Yeah. So the reason I was asking is it feasible to go back to regular tests and extract these data from there, or do you have to sort of acquire the data specifically for this?
We acquire it simply for this. We first take a few readings of the normal, what we call the spatial, and then afterwards we take the measurements for what we used to call the temporal, the intra-breath. So at the moment, it's still different measurements that we need to take.
Okay.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that the tremor flow is actually so in their investigation mode, they actually do have a single as they've done here, this one that's used. And Charles, that makes it a whole lot easier because you can actually get some of these variables out without doing the tedious sort of analysis that you'll be familiar with.
Di, do you know, is that kind of like additional software that we could request from Thoracic, or is it?
Yes, it is, and I'm not entirely sure whether if it's commercially available or not. But you could just check with them. Yeah, I'm not up to date with how far they are with that.
They were at ATS, and I did chat with them a bit.
What did they say?
I didn't talk about this specifically,
Okay.
but they were, they were actually, mainly the conversation was about how they're going to be pushing out a software update. So just generally.
Yeah, I suspect it will be in their software update because they've been working on it for a while. But I mean, this would obviously be are these actual impedance values, or are they Z scores I just wondered if they'd adjusted for size of the child.
Yeah, that's a good question.
But this would be really great news if we could do this, because as you pointed out, the MBW is much it's going to be in our setting, it's going to be much more difficult to roll out MBW than oscillometry.
Yeah, I mean, I would suspect that we would need to do some more work in the space in other conditions, but anyway, yeah.
But for sure, if we could get a tool that has is more sensitive than spirometry, especially, be great. Yeah. So this is interesting. Thanks.
Sure. All right. So then, kind of oscillometry and airway disease. So this is, as I said, building on this prior work. So this is again a cystic fibrosis patient population, but the title from the Blaken group is volume dependence. So that's the one parameter that I mentioned earlier of reactance as a measure of ventilation inhomogeneity in cystic fibrosis. So here, this one is a little bit heavier, but so the rationale here is during inspiration, respiratory oscillometry measured reactance changes are driven by high lung stiffness and of the lung and chest wall. Among healthy children, reactance at end expiration is closer to 0 and becomes more negative at end inspiration to produce a negative slope, otherwise known as volume dependence of reactance. And it's presented by this parameter delta X over tidal volume, abbreviated as VT. In cystic fibrosis, a little bit different in that the reactance at end expiration is more negative, rather than being around 0, as in healthy children. So a bit more stiff, potentially, which makes sense, physiologically with underlying pathophys and CF. And this is due to greater lung unit inhomogeneity. And this interestingly normalizes during inspiration to produce a positive volume dependence relationship in this delta X to over VT slope. And so the aim of this abstract was to explore delta X over VT as an index of early ventilation inhomogeneity in young children with CF using, again, intra-breath oscillometry. So this is a single center prospective study, 142 children, mean of 9.2 years. You can see the range there. Heights given, 54% male. And similarly, the author group used the 10 hertz sinusoid waveform on the TremorFlow device. In this work, they classified participants as either, again, these are CF children, as either stable or unwell. Unwell was defined as having increased respiratory system symptoms in the prior 2 weeks. And then they further stratified the unwell group by whether antibiotics were being used or not. And then they did a between group comparison. So in terms of their results, so they did a total of 245 measurements when clinically stable, 34 during an exacerbation without antibiotics, 96 during an exacerbation with antibiotics. And so you can see those 3 columns presented here in the table. And then again, those same parameters used in the far left column, with the parameter of interest really being that last parameter, the delta X over VT. And so basically the take home here is that there's a more positive delta X over VT slope amongst participants having exacerbation, whether or not they have, whether or not they're receiving antibiotics, and that was statistically significant. And this suggests that this parameter, volume dependence of X, delta X over VT, may potentially be a more sensitive parameter for detecting early CF lung disease. And they characterize the next steps as now identifying a potential threshold with this parameter and evaluating changes between visits. And so, again, for us, more common illnesses, airway diseases, of course, asthma would be the one to come to mind as the major one. That this would be something that could be of interest to kind of more widely deploy, given, again, oscillometry is a more potentially an easier test to conduct. Any comments on this one?
Hi, Eric.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Di. Go ahead.
After you, Charles.
No, it's just all very interesting. We out of this intra-breath measurements and the volume dependence, we're getting all these new readings. And I think it's, we noticed when we did a lot of these tests that there's so many readings we can take, and we're not exactly sure what the relevance of them all are yet. So it'll be interesting to get more data on these specific readings to be able to compare and then to see. I mean, it's a nice comment to make that it could be more sensitive or so, but there's still so little data. So it's great to start getting this data so we can start assessing the clinical importance of it all.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on that. Di, did you want to say something?
Yeah, no, I was just wondering, did they include standard measures as well as a comparison as whether these are actually more sensitive than the standard measures? So just the XRS with volume dependence, tidal volume.
Yeah, they didn't present that. They didn't present
Yeah,
that
and I was just
in
just
the
something that
abstract.
interests me. I wonder, you know, what is our gain with intra-breath? Is it good enough to?
Yeah, it's not. Yeah, as somebody coming into oscillometry, you know, as you both know, like I haven't had a lot of experience with intra-breath, but certainly in our discussions in our Bangladesh lab, you know, Zoli is beating the drum, you know, pretty hard that this is something that he really believes in. So, and these are new parameters that I'm also wasn't familiar with prior to the conference.
Yeah, I mean, they make physiological sense that there would be, you know, they're an improvement as well. So I can understand Zoli's enthusiasm. I'm just interested to see if the proof is in the pudding.
Yeah, agree. All right, and then another one on respiratory oscillometry. I'm keeping track of the time here. I think this is number 3. So this one is on quality of respiratory oscillometry measurements. And this is something that, you know, I've been contemplating and just thought it'd be something to share. So this is an abstract on improving quality control in oscillometry, repeatability, efficiency, and accuracy. And this is by Abu Ferde and colleagues. So the rationale that they put forward is that oscillometry acceptance criteria, as we know, requires 3 repeated measures. We used in the coefficient of variation. So this is actually, just to mention, this is a mixed study, so that's adults and kids, just to mention, but there's a lot of kids in this. So 3 repeated measures with a coefficient of variation less than or equal to 0.1 in adults and less than or equal to 0.15 in children, using the RRS at the lowest oscillation frequency. And, you know, it is an approach, you know, this is what's recommended in the technical guidelines, but acknowledging correctly by the authors that this approach does ignore reactance and all the other frequencies. And so their aim here was to assess novel algorithms that basically apply more of the parameters over all the range of frequencies here, and see what they can achieve. So the methods they used automated weighted sums of varying combinations of coefficients of variation of resistance and impedance. So they used impedance here, which incorporated reactance across all the frequencies. And then they looked at permutations of the first 3 measurements that generated a coefficient of variation that met the acceptance criteria. And then of key outcome measures that they essentially flagged, you know, as ones that we use more readily currently, which is R5, you know, although we might use R7, but R5 to 19, X5, and then area under reactance. And so they used 3 data sets. They had a data set of 550 children below 5 years or 5 years of age, 550 children, 110 children 3 to 5 years old with wheeze, and then an adult data set with 818 adults with a variety of chronic lung diseases. Across these 3 data sets, there were a range of, I guess, a minimum of at least 5 up to 12 measurements per subject. And basically their approach was that they used the data set 1 with the 550 children 5 years of age to develop the algorithm. And then the other 2 data sets 2 and 3 to validate it. Excuse me. So there's a lot of words here. I'm sorry. I worked with what I had. From a results perspective, what they found is that using an algorithm with inverse frequency weighted sum of impedance outperformed the current criteria, improving the minimum coefficient of variation of this measure and the outcome measures in achieving quote unquote best feasibility, which they didn't really define in their abstract. So my kind of takeaway is they're using some statistical approaches here basically to improve the algorithm overall. And so the algorithm was more accurate for subjects with a large coefficient of variation compared to coefficients of variations of R5 only. And this was due to greater averaging, including basically all of the data. The algorithm that they employed improved efficiency, reducing the mean measurement number from nearly 5 to 3.6. And then when they restricted their analysis to the first 5 measurements, feasibility improved from no algorithm. So just using, not using the algorithm to using the algorithm from 63% to 85% when looking at data set 1, 61% to 80% using data set 2, and then from 22 to 44% using a manual algorithm, and then versus 77% using an automated algorithm. So here, based on the information that we have and what I've presented, their conclusion was that optimizing the automated CV algorithm based on impedance across all frequencies lowered the variation, improved reproducibility, feasibility, and efficiency. So that's this abstract. Any thoughts or comments here?
Well, thanks so much for presenting this, Eric. I mean, this is something that's obviously much needed with oscillometry, because it doesn't really make sense to just pick it and from using it that just using a CV for R5 seems odd. So I'm fascinated by this. Not quite sure what as you say, the definition of best feasibility, and I don't really understand. My question is it so the algorithm basically categorizes more tests as good quality versus just using the CV of R5? Is that correct?
Well, yeah. So so essentially what I'm kind of taking away is that they were able to reduce the coefficient of variation. That's kind of my interpretation by applying the algorithm. Yeah, that was
and the coefficient of variation would then it represents variation of the algorithm per test. So this aggregated measure of both resistance and reactance at multiple frequencies.
Yeah, I mean, to me, in a simplified, in my own head, in a simplified way, it's basically another example of kind of, machine learning, putting all the data into the basket and understandably being able to improve on a process in which we're using one frequency of one parameter, so I think what we don't know is can this be used outside of these data sets, and what would that actually do? And I think we clearly need kind of more details on exactly what the machine learning algorithm is really doing. Aside more information, I think would be needed from my perspective. But it is, as you say, it is an area that I think we need to figure out. So that's what this group is doing.
Great.
And here's another one on oscillometry quality. So this is getting into sedated infants. So ignore the sedated part, but these are infants essentially. And I just thought this was interesting because I know there's a lot of interest in, infants, neonates, and doing oscillometry in this group and what's the best way to do it. And so this particular abstract is looking at using one hand versus two hands. And this is Samuel J.S. et al. In their group. So the rationale here is that we don't really have a great methodology in infants. It's not standardized when doing oscillometry. It's suggested currently to use one hand holding the measuring equipment with the infant's head in the neutral position. And so essentially what they did is evaluated in sleeping sedated infants, whether oscillometry results differed using a one-hand or two-hand techniques. So they used the N100 for thoracists, and they obtained paired one-hand and two-hand head-supported measurements in infants who are preterm, clinically stable in an outpatient context, sleeping in the supine position following a chloral hydrate sedation. So they did a whole battery of lung function tests on these kids that required chloral hydrate. And so that's why that's in there. So for our perspective, it's in our context, I think it does limit it to generalizability, its generalizability to us, but I thought still worth sharing. So they collected 5 acceptable measurements in the 7 to 41 frequency range. And then they analyzed their data using repeated ANCOVA with nested replicates and adjusted for several factors. And so the results here, there's 38 infants, 18 males, 20 females, born at a mean gestational age of 31 weeks with the given range. And their mean gestational age that was corrected at the time of testing was 7.8 months. So that's the age really when they were tested. You can see the range there. And basically the takeaway here is they didn't see any difference between using one or two hand techniques on the reactance or resistance and at any of the individual frequencies. Resistance did decrease and reactance increased with increasing frequencies. And there were no differences related to gestational age or sex while increasing the age at testing. While the increasing gestational age at testing was associated with a decreased R and a decreased R and an increased X. Impedance, so the author's conclusions, kind of all this taken together, was that impedance was found to be frequency dependent, as they would expect, which essentially I think kind of somewhat validates what they were doing, and as well as the effect at the age of testing, but that the results did not differ between using either techniques. Any comments there? All right, we will move on. Maybe I'll go for 5 more minutes and then pause there, or you guys can guide me on that. So this is an abstract with the single occlusion technique. So this is by Leeds, HS and colleagues. And so this is a pulmonary function testing in neonates with congenital heart disease. And so here, the rationale of the authors was that neonates with congenital heart disease may also have altered lung development. And their aim was to compare neonates with CHD, those with single and two ventral physiology, to term infants. They hypothesized that infants with CHD would have a higher passive respiratory resistance. And so these were infants who are greater than 37 weeks gestation, with single or two ventricle physiology. They did the PFTs before cardiac surgery, so they're uncorrected. They used a single breath occlusion technique, so it's a different technique than the other abstracts, used to measure resistance and passive respiratory compliance. They then had a historical reference group of 31 term infants, and they had calculated their power they were sufficiently powered essentially at the effect size of a 25% difference in passive resistance between the groups, and then essentially compared the two groups using standard statistics. And so here, the results, there's 24 infants with congenital heart disease, 12 single, 12 two ventricle physiology. These were young newborns, so a median of 2 days of life. Again, they're all uncorrected. They were compared to 31 healthy term infants that were measured within 72 hours of birth. This is a historical control group. The CHD group, their mean gestational age was 38 weeks. And then the healthy group was 39 weeks. Birth weights 3.2 versus 3.5 amongst those same groups. And so, yeah, basically here you can see from the table, again, in the left-hand side, we have several single occlusion technique parameters. And then you have the CHD infants and then the reference infants. And then what's starred in the reference infants column here are statistically significant. And basically here you can see that the passive respiratory compliance is lower in the CHD infants, and as well as the total respiratory system compliance there. And so they didn't see any difference in resistance and in tidal volume. But the value here, I think, is that the lower passive respiratory system compliance in CHD kids versus term infants could impact their postoperative course. And I think here it just, to me, was an interesting study, bringing in both a different technique as well as a different group of infants with congenital heart disease. Any thoughts or comments here? This one's maybe a little more straightforward. All right, and then spirometry. Yeah, so this is an abstract looking at the Global Lung Function Initiative reference equation. So this is by Conj and colleagues. So the title is Application of the GLI Global Spirometry Reference Equations to a Large Population across a multi-site academic healthcare system. So GLI Global Reference Equations were derived by reanalyzing an original data set using inverse probability weights for race-neutral option for spirometry interpretation. But the impact of this change and the implementation of it is not yet well understood. So these authors sought to describe the direction and magnitude of change in predicted lung function measurements per GLI global compared to the previous GLI 2012, which was race-based. And so this is using a Mayo Clinic in Minnesota in the United States, a lung function database. It's a huge data set, 166,000 baseline spirometry tests that we're using the GLI global reference equations. Participants ranged from 5 years of age to 95 years of age. This is a mixed study. They don't give the age breakdown, I don't believe. So I suspect, we're talking about amongst the pediatric context, older children, adolescents. And these were data between 2016 to 2022. They compared the percent predicted measures using GLI Global compared to GLI 2012. And the changes in lung function interpretation were compared across self-declared race, ethnicity groups. So here, there's a lot of information here. I'll try to see if I can capture all of it, but the GLI Global increased the mean FEV1 and FVC percent predicted in white and Northeast Asian groups. It decreased these FEV1 and FVC percent predicted amongst Black populations, which was also represented the greatest change amongst the Black population, as well as in Southeast. It also decreased in Southeast Asian groups, as well as mixed in other groups. So overall, 13,080, or roughly 8% of all tests were changed. Again, the highest percentage of change occurred in the Black subgroup, 14.3%, and increased, notably, I think, increased abnormal interpretations by not an insubstantial amount, up to 28.8%. And so this particular table here, so if you can kind of look at the different race ethnicity groups are listed in the left-handed column, and then across these rows, you can kind of see. So these are overall frequencies, so prevalences here. And so this column here is looking at obstructive spirometry results, and then possible restriction spirometry results, with split into the GLI 12 versus GLI Global, and then the change. And so this change, again, is kind of the overall frequency change. And you can kind of see here how that worked out and there is a change in the white subgroup, here in the obstructive parameters, and then in the possible restriction parameters, the Black subgroup and Southeast Asian subgroups were kind of most effective in the positive direction, but also I think it's notable to look at the change in the other direction as well. It's not insubstantial either. And so the takeaway here is that GLI Global will clearly impact lung function interpretation, but the authors noted that it's important to consider that the uncertainty will persist among those around that lower limit of normal. So that'll still be there. I think this might be my last abstract, so I'm going to stop there. Any comments on this one?
Super interesting.
Cool. I hope it was helpful.
Yeah, thank you so much. Definitely enjoyed that. Thanks a lot for summarizing and presenting it for us. It's from me.
Yeah, Eric, thank you very, very much. I mean, not all of us could make it all, well, very few of us could make it all the way over there. And it's just amazing how much work is being done. And thanks for sharing, what you saw there and putting into this presentation for us. It's really, it's opened my eyes. There's quite a bit out there and helpful stuff being done as well. So thank you.
Cool. Yeah, total pleasure. Thanks for inviting me to share this. Appreciate it.
Does anybody, guys, I think it's just, sorry, I forgot to say before Refugee gets angry with me, the meeting it's for CBD points. It's listed for CBD points. If anybody wants, please, if you're Hawaii Y7'219 or something like that, we can't actually identify you. So just if you have a strange name, just please put down your name and your numbers. And does anybody have any other comments or anything like that they'd like to add, or questions they'd like to ask? Okay, so in that case, Eric, once again, thank you very much. And Guy, thanks to you and Marika for always, and Rafiu and you guys for always organizing such a lovely meeting. And thanks for inviting me to chair it today. And I'm going to send off then and say, good afternoon, everybody. Have a great day.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks so much.
Hi, everyone.
Bye, everyone.